Good morning. This is Chair French, and I'm convening the regularly scheduled business meeting of the Kansas Corporation Commission for this Tuesday, September 28th, joined by my colleagues, Commissioner Duffy and Commissioner Keene. On today's agenda, we have 25 consent agenda items, one noticed item, and one discussion item. Would be a brief update from Mr. Stanley Adams from the Commerce Department. So we will begin with our consent agenda items today. Commissioners, you've had an opportunity to review all of the items on the consent agenda. Let me ask at this time whether you have any questions about those items, beginning with Commissioner Keene.
None for me, thank you.
Commissioner Duffy?
Good morning, Mr. Chair. I have no comments or questions, and I move adoption of the consent agenda.
Second.
We have a motion and a second to approve the consent agenda. Is there any further discussion of that motion? Hearing none, those in favor, please vote aye.
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 Aye. Consent agenda is approved. We will now move to our first noticed item. This is in docket number 21, VICE 412 TAR. This is a proposed order on application of the Victory Electric Cooperative Association. And our presenter for this item is Mr. David Cohen. Good morning, David.
Good morning, Commissioners. Before you is an order approving Victory Electric's application to update its local access delivery tariff. The application also increases the revenue requirement. On May 3rd, 2021, the Victory Electric Cooperative Association filed an application seeking approval to update its local access delivery tariff in accordance with the formula-based rate approved in 21 SCPE 049 TAR. Pre-filed testimony concurrent with the application was filed by Shane Laws, CEO for Victory, and Richard J. Mackey, Vice President for Economics, Rates, and Business Planning for Power Systems Engineering, in support of the application. The application requested an increase in the revenue requirement from $3,119,336 to $3,854,898, which necessitated an increase in the customer charge. Here, the customer charge would increase from $3.05 to $3.69 per kilowatt month, a 17.3% increase. While that percentage increase seems dramatic, it only addresses charges for transmission, not the total bill. The total bill would not increase by 17% for customers based on this change. The primary factor in this increase is a true-up adjustment from being an under recovery compared to an over recovery in last year's filing. Kansas Electric Power Cooperative, Kansas Municipal Energy Agency, and Kansas Municipal Energy Agency were granted status as interveners, but did not file testimony. On August 31st, 2021, staff filed its report and recommendation. Staff found one error that would increase the revenue requirement about $4,000, but leave the local access delivery charge the same due to rounding. On September 15th, Victory filed a rebuttal to staff's R&R, noting they had found an error in staff's calculation, which would bring the revenue requirement to $3,860,536 and the local access delivery charge up to $3.70 per kilowatt month. Victory testified that staff was aware of and agrees to these corrections. This order would approve Victory's application as modified by staff's R&R and Victory's rebuttal. I'm available for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Cohen. Let me turn to my fellow commissioners at this time to see if they have any questions of you. I will begin with Commissioner Keene.
None for me, thank you.
Commissioner Duffy.
I have no questions. My only comment is, Mr. Cohen, I do appreciate your explanation so that anybody watching or viewing can really understand the effect of what we are doing. With that, I move approval of this docket.
Second.
Order, I'm sorry.
We have a motion and a second to approve the order, the proposed order in this docket. Is there any further discussion on that motion? Hearing none, those in favor, please vote aye.
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 Aye. The order is approved. Thank you, Mr. Cohen. We will now move to our discussion item, and this is an update presentation to the commission regarding broadband development in Kansas. And our presenter for this item is Mr. Stanley Adams, the Director of the Office of Broadband Development in the Kansas Department of Commerce. Good morning, Mr. Adams. And you're still on mute at this time. We'll have to get that figured out again. There you go.
Okay, how about that? Is that working?
Perfect.
Okay, great. All right. I put a good morning, and thank you for having me. I did put together just a couple of slides. If I can share, if that's allowed, if I can do that, I can just briefly give you an update of what's going on. And there actually is quite a bit going on, so I'm really happy to have the opportunity to give you this update. Just let me confirm you guys can see my screen.
It says you have, there we go. Yep, we can see your screen now.
Okay, great. Let me just go ahead and end this. Okay, that should be good there. Okay, so well, quite a bit has been going on. Just in general, lots of activity on our side, just really trying to get a handle on some of the federal funding that's becoming available. And I'll give you a brief overview of those. I wanted to touch on first the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. I wanted to just give you a quick highlight. It's not a program that our office had a role in. It's an FCC program, but it's big, which makes it noteworthy. It was a $20 billion fund that was established. This was pretty much a follow-on to some other major programs that the FCC had put together over the years for broadband infrastructure. In this case, $20 billion to close the digital divide, focused on infrastructure, and it was via reverse auction. The first wave of $300 million is where they're at right now. It's a phase. This RDOF goes over a period of, I think it's 10 years, 7 to 10 years, a very large program. In the case of Kansas, there were some awards in the initial, round on the RDOF. One of them of note was LTD. They actually, let me back up. There were 12 initially in Kansas. One of them, LTD, ended up getting, I understand they ended up getting their award being revoked. I wanted to just give you a quick understanding of what was going on there as far as we can tell. But again, our office did not play a role in this at all. But apparently there was some issues with their status as an ETC for the states. I believe they were awarded in 3 states, or 3 states they were revoked in. So they had planned and were awarded tentatively for Wyandotte and Leavenworth County, a total of $3 million that was going to help broadband expansion there, and that's what was revoked. As far as we're aware, the other awards are still moving forward. There, and it's worth mentioning just in general, the RDOF has been the subject of a lot of conversation, a lot of concern in certain quarters of the industry that some of the major awardees, some of them, their concern was whether or not they'd be able to fulfill the commitments. This is a gigabit-enabled support. So you had some firms that, like LTD, I believe, was traditionally a fixed wireless firm, and they're moving into the gigabit or fiber space. So a lot of moving parts there. I would say par for the course in the grand scheme of things of how these things work out. Such a large program, and there is a lot of folks that are moving into the space. And this RDOF is pre-pandemic, by the way. But subsequent to that, as you all know, and I'll talk about next, a lot of other federal funding has become available. I wanted to first mention the NTIA Broadband Infrastructure Program. The consolidated appropriations that Congress passed and was enacted in December of last year included several funding programs, including the $288 million for the NTIA's broadband infrastructure. That's a $288 million opportunity nationwide. In the grand scheme of things, that's actually not a lot of money, highly competitive. And I believe there ended up being over 80 applications coming from our state alone. Let me just give you a little bit of perspective. this was a unique approach that the NTIA took with this funding program, and we did play a role in this one. Because what they did was the NTIA guidance came out and said, we really want to push the money to the right places, and states where you have a broadband office, we will accept applications from the state, and the state can offer to, in their application, can provide multiple projects. So we did that. We reached out, again, as with so many things, in a hurry-up manner to meet the deadlines that they had. We submitted an application August 17th and expecting the award notification to be November 29th. But as you see here on the slide, we ended up requesting in our application $13.5 million, and that's with 7 service provider partners. We asked the partners to reach out and give us what they thought they could get done for this infrastructure project. They came back. We submitted for 10 proposed projects across the state. This is similar to what we're seeing in other funding mechanisms. There's a strong move towards funding the more robust types of networks. Preference is given to the capability to offer higher upload and download speeds. So as I mentioned, we're in contact with the NTIA, working through the process, and optimistic that we'll get at least some of those projects awarded. Again, the key point that I would point out, the key point to make here is this one is a particularly competitive opportunity. 13 million is more than if you just did a proportion by state. We leaned in and tried to get as much as we could. The signals that we're getting is positive, but we expect most states submitted more than well, they were way oversubscribed. So we're cautiously optimistic, but we'll see what happens. So that's going on. That's a major opportunity we just submitted last month. I wanted to mention in the similar funding mechanism, there were 2 others, at least there were several others, but I wanted to highlight 2 others. The $1 billion tribal fund was included in that same funding for that Consolidated Appropriations Act. That we are actively been involved in that, but we're not the applicant. The tribes are the actual applicants, but we've worked with our 4 tribes to see where we could help, and we offered, we had our consultants working with a couple of them and supporting them in trying to get some of that fund. That fund at $1 billion, the competitive point is not operative, but what is operative is, we're really we encourage those applications to lean in and go for the as much as possible the future-proof type of network builds, because this is as you all know, the funding level in general for broadband is historic and a once in a generation, probably more. It's probably not even a generation, but this is an opportunity when you see $1 billion for the tribal and the others that I'll talk about here in a second. We really are optimistic about our ability to improve the network availability in the tribes here. The other one noteworthy, $288 million, again, another relatively small allocation nationwide for connecting minority communities. That is a fund they set up for historically Black colleges initially, but they expanded it. Because in the case of Kansas, we don't have any HBCUs, but they expanded the eligibility to minority serving institutions, of which we do have a couple of those. And that application is pending. That's the actual active work that we're promoting. Again, we will not be the applicants in this case, but are supporting our institutions and encouraging them to apply. So there were other funding mechanisms came out of that Consolidated Appropriations Act, including the Emergency Broadband Benefit, which you all may have heard of. Again, our office doesn't directly deal with that, but we're simply trying to promote that it is available for people to take advantage of. So that's a little bit of what's going on there. And then I wanted to turn to the much larger funding opportunities. The scope of these opportunities are obviously getting pretty large. And you all are probably familiar with the ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act. the state is working through how they're going to allocate those funds. I think it's $1.6 billion for Kansas in total. But I wanted to highlight that within ARPA, there is a specific carve out for broadband called the Capital Projects Fund. Excuse me. So basically, every state under this fund, it was a $10 billion fund for the Capital Project Fund, and every state was guaranteed at least $100 million under that fund within ARPA, the CPF. Our state allocation, and it varied by how rural your state was, the percentage of the rurality, and there was an income dimension, and our share ended up being, our allocation ended up being $143.3 million. It's a multi-year program, which is good news for us. We will be, and we do have to submit an application outlining our plan, which we're actively working on right now, and expect to have completed in the next few weeks, and ahead of schedule, hopefully, is what we're tracking to. We would be submitting our application to the U.S. Treasury, is the way this program is set up, or at least that's our intention. We're working the process. The key point here on the Capital Projects Fund, I mentioned that it is specifically for broadband. The guidance just came out last week from the Treasury Department. They actually threw a third, you see here the three, we are expecting the two, the broadband infrastructure and the digital equity or digital connectivity technology we were expecting. They added something called multi-purpose facilities, which is makes eligible in constructing buildings actually, or improving buildings from a connectivity standpoint. And all of the emphasis, all of these eligible projects need to be demonstrated benefiting remote work, remote learning, and remote healthcare. So it's a pandemic related, and the guidance suggests that they will require linkage to that. And again, in the case of broadband, that's not ultimately the heavy lift part of the process, because broadband obviously does enable people to be able to work from home, people to be able to see their doctor via telehealth, and certainly allows students as needed to be able to do their classwork online, or certainly their homework. So that's that's the first big opportunity. I will share just in general the perspective and context that we're receiving, because I'm going to talk about the pending infrastructure bill. When the ARPA came out and the Capital Project Fund was announced, the point was made to us as state broadband leaders that the CPF was a down payment on what they thought was possible for funding. So there was an intention to do a larger opportunity for funding in the infrastructure bill, but I am not going to count chickens before they're hatched, is probably the best way to put it. So hopefully the infrastructure bill will get passed. Not to get in the weeds on it, they're going to vote on Thursday. This, if you all are following a bit of the news, there's what they're calling a two-step. The Senate approved the bill for the infrastructure that included $65 billion in total related to broadband, and then the House has to approve it. And there's some. So my point is, there's still possibilities that these numbers will move around. The guidance we're hearing is that the debate is not over broadband, so we're cautiously optimistic that what we're hearing is going to become reality. There's $65 billion in total proposed. Of that, $42 billion is for broadband equity access and deployment fund that they will propose to establish. That's heavy on the infrastructure, but importantly, it also is going to have a very large dimension on just being a little bit more community anchor institutions, but again, infrastructure focused. And then you see here, $2.75 billion is allocated, proposed allocated for digital equity and inclusion. Of note, the proposal is going to require every state who wants, because again, there's a funding opportunity for all states to participate in, and it will be contingent on the state having a digital equity plan. So we obviously are moving towards that, and I'll talk about that in a second. But lastly, on the pending bill, there's another $1 billion for middle mile infrastructure as well. So the $42 billion, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Fund, is really targeting last mile construction. And if you just think about, I just want to put context around the dollars here. Looking at the Capital Projects Fund, it was a $10 billion fund nationwide, and our share was $143 million. The BEAD, $42 billion, as in a factor of 10 or a factor of fourfold over the Capital Projects Fund. So you can see, and the way they disperse it is not going to be identical to how they did it for the Capital Projects Fund. So it's not a one-to-one relationship, but just conceptually, we are optimistic that we'll have a much larger funding opportunity to build on. Having said all that, the state is also, we're just in the final stages of completing our broadband strategy. We commenced with developing a comprehensive strategy, recognizing that these funding opportunities were coming and recognizing the just obvious importance and criticality of having all of our state connected. We put together a plan that puts us on a path towards getting everyone connected. So like I said, stay tuned for that. I'd love to be able to come back and give you a fuller briefing on it, because I think it's really good work once we get finished with finalizing it. I think you'll find it very informative. The highlights are, no surprise, robust infrastructure is the biggest piece of that from a funding standpoint. But there are 4 priorities that we identified. It's the robust infrastructure with an eye towards putting infrastructure in that's going to last, and not trying to do the band-aids wherever possible. And again, that's consistent with the guidance we're seeing from the Treasury Department on the CPF, and we expect that's going to be consistent with the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Fund as well. Adoption and digital equity is the second of our key areas of focus. Transformative applications. Transformative applications is simply talking about busting through some of the silos, making sure that we are being innovative and prepared to take advantage of education and healthcare in particular, and others, applications that can harness robust infrastructure and enable our economy and enable our communities to be more participatory in the digital economy. And then lastly, the area of focus just more broadly is making sure we have the capacity, the data for Kansas to be a leader rather than a laggard when it comes to connectivity, so that we are competitive. So that's just a little bit of a highlight there. Happy to take questions. I didn't want to go too deep in the weeds on this, but as you see, I think the theme here is there's a fairly significant pipeline of funding. The Office of Broadband Development is getting itself configured to manage these number of projects. We have consulting support, and we anticipate at least adding a few staff as well, because we want to make sure we're able to execute against the funding that's available.
Well,
So
thank you.
To take questions. That was hopeful for you guys.
This was great. Mr. Adams, this was the perfect update that we needed. I'll turn to my fellow commissioners here in a second. I just want to make a couple comments, not necessarily any questions for you. It is good that we received these updates from you, because while our jurisdiction over broadband is somewhat limited, we do interface. And one example would be, I appreciated your update on the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund and LTD, the company that had its award revoked. I was not aware of that yet, but I do know all 3 commissioners had signed on to a letter expressing some concern about some of the bidders several months ago, because we in talking to our colleagues throughout the region understood that we had some fixed wireless providers making bids claiming they would provide gigabit service, and that was obviously a concern to us. And so signed on to a letter asking the FCC to closely scrutinize to make sure that the service promised could actually be provided. And so that was, our comments were not specifically targeted at that company, but more general. But that was a very good update to understand that. It also displays how our jurisdictions can somewhat overlap, and that we are asked to provide feedback. So thank you for that. And then just as another point, thank you for the update on all the different avenues and opportunities that are becoming available. Obviously, the last couple of years, while they've had their obvious downsides, have also, the silver lining perhaps is us understanding the importance of what you're doing and the importance of broadband for our state and all the citizens, and that all folks equitably have access to it. And so let me just express my appreciation for everything you're doing to plan for that in regard to the state, and also to make sure that we're hooked up with all the opportunities to take advantage and make sure that all Kansans have access. So thank you very much. And I will turn to my fellow commissioners to see if they have any questions or comments of you on your presentation. And I will begin with Commissioner Duffy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you, Stanley. Boy, it looks like you need to clone yourself 4 times over. But along the vein, I would like to ask, what is your staffing level right now in the Department of Commerce?
Right. So there's myself and Melinda Stanley right now, just the 2 of us. And we do have some consulting support, but the game plan and our strategy calls for, what we think we'll need from a staffing standpoint. And we've gotten the feedback from the administration that is being received, and they're working on it. So I'm cautiously optimistic we'll be able to move on that. It's active. That's an active issue for us. We're working through.
And it's my understanding that in terms of applying for, there's a myriad of pockets here. And are you always the applicant, or are entities applying directly? How does that practically work?
Yeah, that's a great question, Commissioner, because it seems what I would call a shift in approach at the federal level, because as what's happened from a practical standpoint since I've been involved with it, actually, the states have just gradually moved towards having a coordinating office like we have here. And that is actually the brainchild. The impetus of that came from the feds when if you all may remember the state broadband initiative that was an NTIA program back in 2010 when they did the first national broadband map. Part of that was to encourage states to build capacity, because this is not, this is a very recognized set of issues when it comes to connecting all of our citizens. So what's happened is now that most states have a broadband office, the impetus is moving towards those offices becoming more engaged in actual applications, which is what we're seeing now. We'll be applying to the U.S. Treasury for that capital projects fund, and then we'll have to turn around and receive applications from the community, from service providers, and set the guidance. And it gives the state a little bit more input into how resources are deployed. It's not always going to be that way. Like the FCC programs typically just do not go that way, right?
Right.
But I think with the capital projects fund is, if that's any indication, and I think it is, the impetus is going to be to try to drive larger shares of funds. And I've heard this from my colleagues across other states as well, because sometimes it's hard to, from Washington, D.C., really get it right. The whole kind of, the LTD example and others, where you try to push the funds there where you think it'll make sense. And the state doesn't, like I mentioned, the state didn't have any involvement in that one at all. So hopefully we will continue to play that role. We're getting a lot of lessons learned along the way, and we're doing a lot of listening to our service providers to help make sure we understand what they see as important for us to consider as we move forward, because they recognize the funding opportunities as well.
Yes. So I know that you get this, that there's so much money becoming available that to be able to really take advantage of what is available and making sure that Kansas gets their fair share. However that is done is daunting. And that's why I would support any assistance you're getting in terms of additional staff, because a party of one or even two cannot do this well. Too many competing interests, and this is about dotting the i's and crossing the t's when you're making application or you're seeing the application through. And although the FCC does play a role in reviewing and auditing, I do believe that we're better able to see what is really happening here in real time ourselves and report back. They, I don't believe, have the wherewithal to do that site very well. I think my comment is broadband is economic development. We need it now. It ensures the future of this state. If we don't move quickly and we don't do this well, the ramifications will affect us for a long time. This is just as important as any other utility that residents or small businesses or a farmer can have. I mean, this is make it or break it. And so whatever we can do over here at the KCC to support you in your efforts and share information or be your cheerleader, I think that's what we want to do, because so much is at stake in terms of just getting the dollars in the door, which means we're competing, and then making the projects happen and happen well, so that the folks in all parts of the state are able to finally say, wow, I'm not just buffering anymore. So thank you. And I hope that you continue to come back and visit with us and share kind of your Gantt chart of where we are, where we're going, and our accomplishments to date. Thank you very much.
Yes, of course.
Sandy.
Happy to do that.
Commissioner Keen, any questions or comments?
Well, good morning, Stanley.
Good
Thank
morning.
you so much for your report. I don't have any questions. I'd have to really conjure up one. Your report was so thorough that I think it's kind of an interim. It's a work in process. We get that, and we wish you the very best. I would just simply join with both of my colleagues in expressing my appreciation to you for sharing the information you've shared with us this morning. I think it gives us a pretty good overview and some insights into the things you're facing and where you're headed. And I too would join them in hoping that you'll return again.
For sure.
Commissioner Duffy, did you have something further?
Yeah, I would ask Stanley, is there anything that we can do for you right now? Is there, and if you can't think of something now and you do later on, let us know, or if issues arise, please feel confident that you can call us. And conversely, if we hear information, again, as we visit with our colleagues, especially in the Midwest part of the country, Chris Nelson up in South Dakota, he is a commissioner that has taken on broadband as he's wrapped his arms around it very tightly. And he's the one who, in his reporting, has shared to us what's going on in South Dakota in their quest to be all things broadband. So please know that we're available.
Well, I appreciate that, Commissioner. And you hit on the very point I was going to mention for sure, which is to let me know what you're hearing, kind of thing. one of the, for like I said, we're learning a lot along the way. And one of the things we did is we included in our processes, and we learned this in our pandemic response program as well, to create a mechanism for, when someone's proposing, when a service provider is proposing a project, to make sure that we have a way for, there to be a review of, is that area actually already served or not, so that everybody kind of has a level playing field and we're not funding areas that don't actually need it. So we create that opportunity for the communication to happen in our process. And I think as we go forward, that'll become more important, because we'll have more, the first few, I wouldn't call them low-hanging fruit, because there's still a lot of that actually. But as we move forward, I envision there being a greater attention to making sure that we're pushing it out into areas that make sense. That's why we always want to get feedback. The other thing I think is just really worth highlighting again, the direction of guidance that we're seeing is basically pushing for these funds to be moved, federal funding to be moving towards minimum speeds of 100 down, 20 up. The bias is becoming for symmetrical 100. And the language that we just saw last week, it was pretty aggressive in that regard. And what that means for us, we're optimistic of what it will mean for us, is some of those areas that are absolutely have zero or really substandard access, that our providers in our local communities will be able to create projects where the business case is more likely to be supported by encompassing an area that doesn't have that higher minimum speed, so that you can actually, because one of the problems in some of our biggest challenges or least served areas is because it's so sparse that even if we pay for the infrastructure, nobody wants to operate the network. So we're just being mindful of that and wanting to make sure that we continue to keep engaged with you all, so that we can be smart about how we make our investment.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. Those are great suggestions, and we certainly will have our staff be available to you. If you ever have questions about providers or any information you're receiving, we are happy to discuss anytime. And I'll just leave it at this, that this is just incredibly important work that you do, and it's becoming more obvious how important it is. Something like video conferencing, I don't think 3 or 4 years ago we would have thought of that as a basic human need, but I think it's beyond debate at this point, as much as it's used, as you mentioned, for education and healthcare services now. Folks in rural parts of the state need to be able to access it, and importantly, folks in disadvantaged communities need to be able to access it at reasonable pricing. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing to plan and to try to get access for residents of the state. And appreciate the update, and we'll look forward to another one maybe here in a few months.
Thank you, commissioners. I appreciate it.
All right, thank you all. We have now reached the conclusion of our noticed items on today's agenda. If there is no further business to come before us this morning, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
A motion and a second to adjourn. Those in favor, please vote aye.
Aye.
Aye. We are adjourned. Take care, you all.
Take care.
Thank you.